Hey everybody, it's me. I hope you're all having a great Sunday morning or afternoon, depending on when you're seeing this video. Actually, it looks pretty dark out. I wonder if it's going to rain today. Anyway, so I got up this morning, actually like an hour ago, and all of a sudden, just completely out of the blue, I decided that I wanted to put together a video explaining the difference between hardly, barely, and rarely. I don't even know why, because normally I don't even like to do things like this. As I always say, you don't learn things like this from someone trying to explain it. You learn it through experience. So, and it takes time. You use English for many years, and you slowly gain an understanding of how similar expressions and similar words have subtle differences in meaning and in use. And it takes time. You can't just, sit here and listen to me for about 10 minutes and just completely understand everything. And so in that sense, I do want to make sure that you understand that this will not be a comprehensive overview of these three words, by no means, okay? It's just something that I put together very quickly this morning, and hopefully it will be a good starting point for some of you, because I know that there is still a handful of you out there who are just completely clueless as to how these words are different from each other. And I don't blame you. It's very confusing. Even as I was going through some of the examples that I'm going to show you right now, I found some of them to be very confusing because of how subtle the differences were. But that just goes to show that English is nothing like math. You should not approach learning a language like math. You should approach it like learning a language. Anyway, so let's get right into it. In fact, I have everything typed already. Let's look at it right now. I'll share my screen over here. It's not going to be very well organized, but just bear with me here. Okay, so hardly, barely, and rarely. I think all I need to do today is just point. So hardly, barely, and rarely. What I found. Now remember, I'm not an expert, and I'm probably not even close to speaking the language on a native level, but I do use the language quite a lot, and I do feel quite comfortable with it, at least as much as I do with Korean. So anyway, what I found was hardly puts slightly more emphasis on the negative meaning, and I'll get into what I mean by that. So look at this sentence here. I hardly finished it in time. I hardly finished it in time. So the way I want you to look at this sentence right now, the way I want you to look at it is a recurring thing that happened in the past. So maybe, for example, you're talking about a previous job, and you're talking about how much you struggled at that job, and I don't know, for some reason it just wasn't for you. And you're saying that, whenever my boss gave me something to do, I hardly finished it in time. Okay, so you're actually talking about a recurring thing that used to happen at your previous job. In that case, if you said, I hardly finished it in time, it's pretty much the same as saying, I almost never finished it in time. And in that sense, it's very similar to saying, I rarely finished it in time. Yes, you could in fact say I rarely instead of hardly. Then what's the difference? Well, it's not that important. In this context here, the difference between rarely and hardly is not that important, although there is a very subtle difference. Hardly, as I said in the beginning, puts a bit more emphasis on the negative meaning. So rarely, you're just simply describing that it didn't happen often. Whereas when you say hardly, it does kind of add the element of struggle. So it didn't simply just not happen very often. You struggled to finish it in time. And therefore, it didn't happen very often. Okay? And I added the Korean translation here. Don't look at this right now. I'll explain that real soon. But right now, what I'm explaining is this. 다 끝내는 경우가 거의 없었다. Even in Korean, there are different ways that we can talk about something like this. We can say 제 시간에, we should add 제 시간에 다 끝내는 경우가 없었어. 제 시간에 끝내는 경우가 드물었어. What's the difference there? Many of you will say, well, it's pretty much the same. Maybe there's a subtle difference in the nuance, right? And like I said, you don't have to worry too much about the difference. In this context, they're pretty much the same. Now look at this one. 아직 멀었다. Now this is something, this one actually belongs here. Here, okay. So look at this one. Now I removed the in time expression. I removed it here, right? It's just, I hardly finished it. Or it's hardly finished. So let's say you're talking about something that you're working on right now, like a report or something, or your homework. And when you say, I hardly finished it, or it's hardly finished, it means this. It means it's far from being finished. It's far from finished. It's not even close to being finished. Now, in this context, in this kind of situation, it's very different from barely, because barely does not mean it's not even close to being finished. I barely finished it. This means you did indeed finish it. You did indeed finish it, but it was by a very small margin. That means it almost didn't happen, but you barely finished it. It did happen, but barely. Okay? In other words, we can say, I almost couldn't finish it. And in that sense, we can translate it like this. Now, this is a really, really important concept that you need to keep in mind when it comes to barely. When it comes to barely, this is a very, very important translation. If this translation doesn't work, then in most cases, you should not use barely. 못 끝낼 뻔했다. In that situation, you would say, I barely finished it. Again, if you say, I hardly finished it, it's far from being finished. It's not even close to being finished. Whereas if you say, I barely finished it, that means it's done. I did indeed finish it, but by barely. I almost failed. I almost failed to finish it, but I did. Barely. Let's look at another example. She hardly shows up on time. She hardly shows up on time. 약속 시간에 맞춰서 오는 경우가 거의 없다. Could we use barely here? Could we use barely? She barely shows up on time? She barely shows up on time? Let's think about that for a moment, okay? Anyway, so she hardly shows up on time. Yes, this is a very common way that people would talk about something like this. So this, well, so this would mean that she almost never shows up on time. Okay, that's fine. She almost never shows up on time. She hardly shows up on time. And in that sense, we can, of course, we can say she rarely shows up on time. Basically means the same thing. Hardly puts a bit more emphasis on the negative, but like I said, it's negligible. You don't really have to worry about the subtle difference there. She hardly shows up on time. She rarely shows up on time. They're pretty much the same. Let's look at this one. She barely shows up on time. The problem here is the tense. If you use the present tense like this, you are talking about a recurring thing, something that happens again and again, okay? Because it's the present tense. You're talking about a general fact. She barely shows up on time. 그녀는 겨우 시간 맞춰서 온다? I mean, it makes sense, but would you really say this? The reason I point this out is because if you say she barely shows up on time, that means she does shows up on time, but by barely. But then, when you think about it, why is that a problem? I mean, she shows up on time, right? Does she have to be early? Yes, that's the kind of tone that you're giving out when you say that. If you say she barely shows up on time, look at this. It sounds like you expect her to show up early. And if that's the case, yeah, sure, you can say this. So grammatically, there's no problem here. It's just a usage. You just have to make sure that that's what you are trying to imply. So for example, maybe you're talking about someone that you meet regularly, and you say, oh, we meet about 2 or 3 times a month, and whenever we meet, she barely shows up on time. So it kind of sounds like you're expecting her to be early. Okay, just keep that in mind. Now, in that case, I want to suggest another way that we can express that. So look at the sentence here. She always shows up at the last minute. This is another way. If this is what you mean, of course you can say this, but this could be another better way. A more natural way, maybe. I'm sure a lot of you know what this means, at the last minute. So waiting until it's absolutely necessary and then doing it. Yeah. So you could submit a report at the last minute. So right before the deadline. If you look at this and this, they're kind of the same, right? Anyway, so let's move on. This sentence here, now we're using it in the past tense. She barely showed up on time. She barely showed up on time. Okay, so now we're talking about, well, we could be talking about a recurring thing that happened in the past, but let's just think of this as referring to something that happened once. Okay, so look at this. 그녀는 겨우 시간 맞춰서 왔다. Okay, and so what does that mean? That also means 늦을 뻔했다. 늦을 뻔했다. Remember I said that this was really important. 못할 뻔했다. This is a very important translation when it comes to barely. If this translation sounds awkward, then you probably shouldn't use barely. Now look at here. She barely showed up on time. 겨우 시간 맞춰서 왔다 means 늦을 뻔했다. 늦게 도착할 뻔했다. It works, right? It's perfectly fine. So here, barely is fine. It means she almost couldn't show up on time. 제 시간에 도착을 못할 뻔했다. Although this sounds a little awkward because we should probably say it like this. She almost showed up late, or even better, she was almost late. Okay, so that's pretty much the same as barely. Now, let me compare hardly once again because I'm sure a lot of you are a bit confused. Probably the first one. So, I hardly finished it in time. It means 제 시간에 끝내는 경우가 거의 없었다. Here, we can't say 겨우, right? 겨우 제 시간에 끝냈다. No, it means nothing like that. I hardly finished it in time is nothing like 겨우 제 시간에 끝냈다. No, 그런 경우가 거의 없었다. Or when you're talking about something that you're working on right now, it means, oh, it's not even close to being finished. Not even close. It's far from being finished. 아직 멀었다. It's hardly finished. Okay? Whereas if you say, I barely finished it, is that here? Okay. So I barely finished it means, yes, you did indeed finish it. But barely. You barely made it. You barely succeeded. All right. Do I have anything else here? Okay. I think this is the last one. Okay. Now look at this. I hardly slept last night. I barely slept last night. In this context, they're pretty much the same. Although, because this might help, I added the implied meaning. It's not. Don't think of this as a translation, but think of it as the implied meaning, okay? So remember at the beginning I said that hardly puts a bit more emphasis on the negative meaning? So look at this. If you say I hardly slept last night, that means you didn't sleep at all. Almost. You almost didn't sleep at all, okay? If you say I barely slept last night, it means you did indeed sleep, but it was insufficient. It wasn't enough. Not nearly as enough. Okay? And that's the kind of subtle difference that there sometimes is. It's not always there. The difference is not always there, and it's not always very apparent. As always, it completely depends on the context and what you're talking about. But depending on the context, there can be these subtle differences. Now, let me go back to the beginning of this video and remind you of something very, very important. You are not expected, and therefore you should not expect to listen to me for 10 or 15 minutes and just suddenly have a complete understanding of the difference between these very similar vocabularies. It takes time. It takes a lot of experience. How do I know this? Because I experienced it for many, many years. There was no point in time where I sat down and someone explained to me the difference between these three, and I just suddenly understood it and just used them perfectly from there on out. No, there was no point in time where that happened. It was a very slow and gradual process that I probably didn't even realize was happening to me. Okay? And that's actually how we learn a lot of stuff. We don't even realize that we're learning something, but the more we experience it, the more we get better at it, and the better understanding that we have of it. So what I'm trying to say is you need patience. You need to be patient, keep your eyes and ears open. Whenever you come across these 3 words, take a very good, hard look at that sentence, and maybe even collect all of those sentences that you come across, and keep them in one place and go over them again and again. That's pretty much the only active thing that I can think of that you can do to speed the process. All right, well, like I said, this is by no means a comprehensive overview of these 3 words. It's just maybe a starting point for some of you. Okay, so that's pretty much it today. I hope this helps, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and weekend, and I hope I can see you again soon in a future live stream or in a future lesson video.